I'm the storyteller, and my stories must be told. I have many stories, tales for both the young and old. I have many voices to describe many places. Many names have I, and many faces. In Russia I am Ivan, in Sweden I am Jan. In Germany I'm Johann, in America I'm John. From my many travels I have gathered these tales to teach you good sense when all else fails. Sometimes there are tears, sometimes there is laughter, but always are happily ever after.
Long ago and far away in a green and pleasant land, where the sun shone daily on the luxuriant tropical foliage, exotic animals of all sizes and many different breeds lived together in harmony, enjoying the natural plenty the land had to offer them. There were herds of buck and deer, giraffe, wildebeest and gazelles that seemed to jump for joy at the pleasure of being alive. Even the birds of prey did not disturb the peace of the other animals. There were many villages in this land where the people too could enjoy the fruits that this bounteous country gave them. In one of these villages, there lived a proud and handsome young man called Kanabe. He was considered extremely fortunate by his fellow villagers, for not only was he very good-looking, but when his parents died, he had come into a considerable inheritance, a herd of 100 fine cattle. Kanabe was very well aware how his wealth should be looked after, and he took great care of his herd by always driving them to the finest pastures and making sure they had plenty to eat. But although he was so well provided for, he was still not entirely happy. The matchmaker had become aware of Kanabe's feelings and suggested that the solution to his problem was simple. He should take a wife. "There are many beautiful girls who would be proud to be your wife, Kanabe," he urged. "It is your duty to marry and raise fine sons. Leave it to me. I shall find the girl who will make you happy all your life long and comfort you in your old age." Kanabe readily agreed, and so without any further delay, the matchmaker, well aware of what a prize the young man was, set off on a long journey, travelling from village to village in search of the girl who would meet Kanabe's exacting requirements. As the villages were all at some distance from each other, this was not a task that he could accomplish in a day, or even a week or two, and so he took his time. And at long last, he reached a certain village where he had heard lived a girl of matchless beauty called Aila. And when he saw this girl cleaning a gourd in the shade of her hut, he realized that rumor, for once, had not exaggerated. Aila was the only child of an old man who was by far the richest man in his village. The matchmaker soon found out that her father would not let her go easily. But the matchmaker persisted, and he promised to convey the old man's terms to Kanabe without delay. If only I had the wings of an eagle or a vulture, he sighed to himself as he made his weary way back to his home village so many miles away. But the thought of what a splendid match he was arranging helped buoy him up for the long journey. And in due course he arrived home, rather footsore, and could report to Kanabe exactly what had transpired between him and Aila's father. Kanabe was staggered at the bride price, but the matchmaker was loud in his praise of Aila's beauty, her virtue, and her talents as a homemaker. So finally, and reluctantly, Kanabe agreed to the terms. Barely pausing to eat a meal and to wipe the dust from his feet, the matchmaker travelled once more to Aila's village. On the way, he encountered many of the dangers the wild country offered the unwary traveller. But by running very quickly, he was able to escape unscathed. And at last he reached the young girl's village. He explained to her father that if Kanabe gave the full bride price for Aila, he would be left destitute and would have nothing to feed himself or his bride on. The matchmaker tried very hard to persuade the old man to accept 50 or even 75 cattle, but still the old man remained absolutely adamant. 100 cattle for my daughter, he said. I insist on that. I do not bargain, as she is worth that and much more. Take it or leave it. The matchmaker realized that Kanabe would be extremely happy with this beautiful young girl. So he accepted her father's terms on the young man's behalf, and without further ado, Kanabe, true to his word, drove his entire herd across the hills and open plains to Aila's village, where he was greeted at the village gate by the old man himself, who wanted to make sure that all the cattle had arrived safely. He was delighted both with the herd and his fine-looking son-in-law, and gave instructions for the wedding feast to begin immediately. It was a memorable feast indeed. All the young warriors and all the young girls joined in the celebrations wholeheartedly. Wearing their finest ornaments, they joined in the singing and dancing. Everyone made merry all day. was only when the tropical night came on that the villagers wearily and happily finished their celebrations and went to sleep. The next day, Aila got ready to leave her home and follow her new husband back to his village, where she would now live for the rest of her life. All the other village girls placed garlands of leaves around her neck and shoulders so that she would always remember her native home. Her father sadly escorted her to the village gates. Although Aila was happy with her fine husband, she showed the traditional reluctance to leave the village in which she had grown up. Having performed this ritual, she followed slowly behind Kanabe and the young warrior who was to protect both of them on their journey to her new home. Apprehensive though she felt, Aila had never traveled this far before, and she looked around her with interest at the scenery and wildlife, and her heart lifted when she realized that she was now Kanabe's wife and would have a home of her own. And when they arrived at his village, she was pleased to see what a prosperous-looking place it was. As they walked through the main meeting ground in the middle of the village, she was greeted warmly, and some of the women gave her gifts for her new home, making her feel welcome. Well, she thought, this is the beginning of a new life for me, and I must make the best of it. And happily she followed her husband into his hut. There he sadly explained to her that her father's bride price had quite impoverished them. There was just enough food to last them a week, no longer. When I owned all those cattle, I could milk them and sell the milk, Kanabe explained. But now that I have had to give them all to your father in exchange for you, I shall have to work by herding my neighbor's cattle. That night, as the sun was setting, he showed her the pastures where he used to graze his own herd. Each morning from then on, he would go out, and where he used to tend his own herd before, he was now in the lowly position of being a cattle herd for someone else, in exchange for some milk for himself and his wife. But nonetheless, the young couple were very happy together, and Aila was sure that sooner or later they would earn enough to get cattle of their own. While Kanabe was tending the cattle, Aila would go to the forests nearby to gather firewood on which to cook their meager meals. One day, while she was collecting wood, a strange and handsome young warrior arrived at the village. He had planned to travel further on, but when he saw Aila, he was immediately struck by her beauty and wanted her to be his wife. Aila was quite flattered, but she was too much in love with Kanabe to take the young man seriously. Laughingly, she told him she would consider his offer and let him know in due course. Some days later, a messenger arrived from Aila's father to tell her that the old man planned to visit her in a few days' time to see how she was getting on in her new home. He told her to get everything ready for his visit. This news deeply upset Aila. They had barely enough food to feed themselves, let alone her father, and she did so want to show him how well they were getting on. As she sat miserably outside her hut, the young warrior passed by and asked her what the matter was. Aila explained that they had no meat to feed her father when he arrived for his visit, and that she didn't want to embarrass her husband by revealing how poor they really were. The young warrior then made his offer. If Aila went away with him, he would give her the meat she wanted. But Aila refused. She only wanted to borrow some food. But the young man insisted. He would gladly give her the food, but only on his terms. Aila explained that she had to entertain her father properly. The warrior refused to be put off any longer and made Aila agree to meet him later that night. Then, happily, the young man gave her a whole pot of meat, which she took into her hut and immediately began to prepare in readiness for her father's visit. As she began to cook, Kanabe came into the hut, and he demanded to know where she had got that meat. She told him that she had borrowed it from some neighbors because her father would arrive shortly. Kanabe was most annoyed to hear this. He did not want to get into debt so early in their married life, and in any event, if there was any borrowing to be done, then it should be he who undertook it. And he left the hut abruptly. Aila was most upset by Kanabe's attitude. Although she was pleased that her father was coming, it seemed that he had caused so many problems in her life. He was the cause of their lack of food, the cause of her agreement with the young warrior, the cause of her first argument with her husband. With a heavy heart, she got ready for her father's arrival. But when the old man arrived the following morning, she welcomed him warmly, as a loving daughter should. Upset though Kanabe was, he was anxious to prove he was a worthy husband for Aila. He strode over with some maize he had borrowed from a neighbor, exchanged greetings with the old man, and then curtly ordered Aila to prepare the maize for her father's meal. The old man studied the young couple, and although he realized that all was not well between them, he said nothing. Aila sadly went into the hut to prepare the maize. While she was cooking it, Kanabe and her father sat outside the hut in the warm sun and exchanged their news. They were so intent on their conversation that they did not even notice the young warrior appear, resplendently dressed in a fine headdress made of ostrich feathers. His face was beautifully marked, and he was wearing all his finery. But when Aila came out of the hut carrying the meal, she saw the young man immediately, and her heart sank. He was obviously determined to have his part of the bargain. While the two men carried on gossiping as they enjoyed the delicious dish Aila had prepared, the young warrior remained sitting a little further away, getting more and more impatient as time went by. He worked himself into a frenzy. He didn't even care that her father and her husband were sitting there. He got up and walked over to the two men. Because they had had such a tasty meal, they were both in a good humor, so they greeted him cordially and invited him to sit down and join them. He was rather taken aback by this friendly invitation, but not knowing what else to do, sat down and began to exchange gossip and news with them, telling them what had been going on in his village. Kanabe, of course, had no idea that this young man was after his wife, but Aila, sitting in the hut, heard every word. Enough was enough. She realized she must put an end to this farce for once and for all. She stormed out of the hut and threw the meat the young man had given her onto the ground. "Eat, you 3 fools," she exclaimed as the men stared at her. "You are a fool because you traded an expensive object for a cheap one. I am your only child. You have thousands of cattle, yet you exchanged me for only 100 more. You regarded those cattle as more valuable than your only child." Her father said nothing. Aila was right. He hung his head in shame. "You were a greater fool," she said. "You exchanged all your cattle for me. There were many girls in many villages whose bride price was only 10 or 20 cattle, but you didn't even look at them. Instead, you exchanged all your cattle for me, and then you had nothing left for us to eat, and this has caused us much unhappiness." Then it was the warrior's turn. "You are the greatest fool of all," she scoffed. "You wanted to buy with a slice of beef what my husband bought with 100 cattle." The warrior realized he would get no further with this clever young woman. Some of the villagers were beginning to watch curiously. He picked up his spear and left the village hurriedly. Everybody in the village knew that something was wrong, and they watched as the matchmaker, fearing the consequences of a grave mistake, took his few cattle and ran away. But the old man realized the truth of Aila's words. He returned to them the 100 cattle, so that Aila and Kanabe were able to live in prosperity as well as happiness for the rest of their days.